This is the Digital Transition Podcast, produced by the Institute of Communication of NOVA University of Lisbon. The Digital Transition Podcast is an initiative of the Doctoral Seminar on Contemporary Culture and Technology with the collaboration of its students.
Today's episode will focus on the philosophical problem of cognition and its practical implications in our digital ecology. In what ways is the mind extended and, at the same time, transformed by new technological artifacts? This and many other questions will be discussed by Professor Robert Clowes, whose work explores the human mind through the framework of 4E cognitive science: embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. Robert Clowes is currently a researcher and invited auxiliary professor at Nova University of Lisbon, and holds a PhD from the University of Sussex. A major strand of his recent work looks at how digital technologies reshape what it means to know, decide, and act. Some of his major publications in this area include the paper The Cognitive Integration of E-Memory and his 2017 monograph Minds Online.
Everyone, welcome to our podcast. Our guest today is Robert Clowes, a distinguished researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at Nova University of Lisbon. Welcome, Robert. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Many thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
We're very happy too. I'm a researcher at Nova University too, at the Institute of Communication, and joining me and helping me with this conversation are also Philip Teuchmann and Diogo Ferreira, also from Nova University, from the doctoral program on Contemporary Culture and Technology. Hi, Philip.
Hi, glad to be here.
Okay, thank you for joining us. Hi, Diogo. Thank you also for joining us.
Hello, so glad to be here as well.
Okay. So, Robert, you received your PhD in philosophy from the University of Sussex, and you are now a senior researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of Nova University, actually the coordinator of the research group on mind, cognition and knowledge at the university. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey in philosophy, and when did you start getting interested in philosophy of mind and why?
So I grew up in quite a working class house, and we didn't have many books in the house really, so we had quite a few books, but so for me books are always quite romantic. So in the first instance I didn't even know what philosophy was actually, really. And I went to work in a bookshop for a short while, and so I was kind of working in a bookshop, and I started to think about what I might do, and actually it took me. I thought I wanted to write more than I wanted to be a researcher. So I got interested in literature and I started to read philosophy, but I still didn't really have, a very deep academic kind of background or knowledge of it. It took, even after I started doing my undergraduate course, it took quite a while. I originally applied to do music and maths, which is a strange. It just shows you how far things can go. And but because of the university had this foundation year, I was able to change. And by the end of the first year, I was actually doing classics, philosophy and literature. And then I dropped classics, and it was you do the. So I ended up doing philosophy, but I really wasn't sure I wanted to continue doing it until the very last year of my undergraduate studies. I came across a book by Daniel Dennett, which was called Consciousness Explained, with this kind of bold title, and it was published. And I thought I was going to give up philosophy, and I read this and I thought, this is just. I didn't agree with it, but I think that's very often that is what happens with philosophers, right? You're actually motivated by the things you disagree with, but the way Dennett approached things was, something very important to me. And I was lucky enough to get an Erasmus fellowship actually. So I went to Italy for a year, still not really knowing exactly what I was going to do, and Dennett happened to be on a book tour around this book at the time. So I was in Italy, in Firenze, when Dennett came through, and I went along to him introducing his book. And it was funny, I remember there was only about 20 people there. I don't think he was quite, certainly in Italy, he wasn't quite the figure that he became. I think he was already very, very important in the, for analytic philosophers. And it made a huge impression on me, because I was doing other kinds of philosophy, and I kind of got the idea really from reading the book and from seeing him speak that, okay, this is what I want to do. And then after that, although I didn't really know how to do it, even though I'd done a degree, because I think if you don't have sort of family in universities, it's very hard to sort of know how to continue and go ahead and what a PhD might mean. But I knew this was the area.
Philosophy has always been, in one way or another, a sort of inquiry into the conditions of truth and knowledge. So what interested you in this other kind of framing those problems? Was it the evolutionary perspective, like in Daniel Dennett? Was it this confrontation between philosophy and sciences?
I think I was a bit alienated at the time from analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy, I mean, I guess I do analytic philosophy now in a sense. We can talk about that. But I was a bit alienated. It felt like the questions were not very interesting in some ways. The way that the questions, it wasn't the questions, I was always interested, but the way they were being framed were not very interesting. But what I found with Dennett, he just approached them in a completely different way. He was reading the psychology of the time, the neuroscience of the time. It wasn't so much the evolutionary stuff. In fact, that was a bit I was, at the time, not so engaged with in a sense. It was I remember, so this was a little bit later, but I remember when I was at Sussex, when I started my PhD, there was a guy who was head of the philosophy department at the time. He shall remain nameless for this, but I remember him saying at one point that there's probably nothing, I think he said. So there's probably nothing that we could learn in brain science that would really tell us anything about the mind. And I think that was a very extreme position that he was kind of taking partly for a kind of a dialectic he wanted to have. But that wasn't a very unusual position at the time. So there's the mind, which is this pure object of study that we can study by philosophy. And then there's the brain. And that's something different. That's what neuroscientists do. And really, philosophy has to keep those two things apart, you could almost argue. It never seemed that approach really made sense to me.
The mind has had many names in philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Logos, reason, spirit. But I would say nowadays it is difficult to do philosophy of mind and not do philosophy of technology. And your work too has been more and more intertwined with the question of technology. And you have 2 ongoing projects on generative AI, also on effective computing or digital companions. You also have edited recently a book on the relation between mind and technology that you frame as the mind-technology problem. But before going into those more detailed aspects of your book, I was wondering, in your view, why did the question of technology take so long to resonate in contemporary philosophy?
Yeah.
And how did you come to bring it to your own work? What was decisive for you?
That's a very, very good question.
Before we also dive into this very timely question of artificial intelligence.
No, I think, to me, I'm not sure I've ever really completely gotten to the bottom of this, but I think if you look at philosophy and the different, we'd have to do a big historical detour, but I think for probably quite sort of, for reasons which are not really to do with the subject matter, the tradition in philosophy of technology, the people who kind of carried that out, and the people who did philosophy of mind were really from different parts of the philosophical world. So philosophy of technology became a kind of continental question in some ways. It has there's a lot of complexity here. This is a huge simplification. And philosophy of mind, the people who treated philosophy of mind were in the analytic side of things. So in a way, the very idea, when I started, I took a really conscious decision. I'm not sure it was a good decision to brand myself, if you like, as a philosopher of mind and technology. But that was almost when I started doing that, which is more or less when I came here, actually, like sort of 15, 16, something like that, quite a while back. There were no philosophers of mind and technology. It's not that I was so original in what I was doing, but I think it just seemed like those are two things that, of course, there were people working in those areas, thinking about mind and technology, but for institutional reasons, they would just sit in different places. So I still think it's quite difficult. If you look at the jobs which are being produced even now, They don't tend to. It tends to be hard to cross that
the
that
connection,
boundary.
as you were saying, the connection between the philosophy of mind and philosophy of language or analytic philosophy is much
Stronger.
much stronger. But isn't that in a way a sort of a go-fi or good old-fashioned philosophy of mind compared to this other connection between the mind-technology problem? The mind-language problem is a sort of a step that would have to be surpassed, perhaps.
So it's very strange because my PhD was sort of on mind and language in some kind of way, but it was not really philosophy of language approach to these questions. And I think, I don't want to go into a caricature, but I think very often, for instance, in Portugal today, very often it is the case that the philosophy of mind and language are considered to be the same thing, right? I think in a way they're pretty distant, and I still think that I think that perhaps this is what you're kind of hinting of. I think I would go as far as to say that the philosophy of language is given as a kind of mismeasure of the mind. The idea that minds are kind of essentially linguiform.
Symbolic thinking.
Symbolic thinking, as you say, it's kind of launched us down a pathway, certainly in philosophy and in cognitive science as well, that for a very long time it kind of misrepresented the way that the minds are. And the thing that probably, when I started doing my PhD, which had an effect on me, but was very much in the air, was this movement for recognitive science, embedded, embodied, extended, inactive. Some bits of this, it has lots of wings to this, and some bits I'm not really on side with anymore. But the good thing about this, the really positive thing about this, was that it was kind of anti-language philosophy. It was kind of anti-language philosophy in a certain kind of way. It was.
When you say that perhaps this question of language had sort of misrepresented our idea of what our minds are. In fact, the Broca area is just a small area in our brain. Isn't perhaps more the case that we were ready to think of reason as language or thinking as symbolic thinking, but perhaps not ready to think of language as an artifact? So much an artifact as any other kind of artifact in which our minds extends. Isn't that also perhaps the problem here?
So I think what I would say now, many years down the line, is that if language is an artifact, and I'm still quite persuaded by certain aspects of that, that idea, it's quite a different sort of artifact than most artifacts we interact with. But
sure.
But I would say that the technologies of language are very rich, very diverse, and growing larger. I use the word advisedly here. And so, our impression of language as, sort of symbols in the head, as you were kind of gesturing towards us, is problematic at a number of levels. And probably one of the things that me and a bunch of colleagues and somebody whose ideas I'm very interested in, Andy Clark, has kind of changed the way you think about these things, was to think about language really as an external system that we kind of interact with as in a tool-like way in many ways. And this does change the picture. It does change the picture of what our minds are and what's essential about our minds. Not sure if that answered the question, actually.
Yes, it did. Well, we had also anthropology, cultural studies, media studies, perhaps more than pointing to this idea that human beings are sort of open-ended co-evolution process with technology, or with language and technology, maybe with the two of them. So my question was a little bit in that direction. Why did philosophy, in a way, came so late to this necessity of making the question of technology more central to its inquiries?
So look, there's in one sense, philosophy is tremendously conservative, right? And so you can go back to Brentano and the intentionality thesis and how that frames things. And many people would still, and the discipline of philosophy still wants to hold, look, I think this is not everywhere, but many parts of the discipline of philosophy want to hold on to this idea that, you know, we can still have this kind of great conversation with the thinkers of the past and the ideas of the past, more or less as though it's us now sitting in the room together, you know, and, you know, the process of discussion is fairly transparent. You know, we're just talking about, and certainly when I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, the historical aspects were more or less entirely abstracted away from. So, you know, we read different philosophers in the main to people do in Portugal, at least in the, you know, we read the, you know, Berkeley, Locke, Hume, you know, they were the centerpiece, Descartes, of course, they were the centerpiece of this discussion. But the sort of historical aspects that many people would focus on now, certainly if they're writing a PhD about, you know, Kant's views on cosmopolitanism or something, you know, you couldn't talk about that today really without having some kind of historical aspect. So I think what happened was this question of intentionality was set up in a certain kind of way, and it unfolded through a long period without anybody really. It was very hard to step outside the sort of closed circle. And the bit, honestly, that I know best about, that I wrote, in many ways I wrote my PhD about, was the point when computationalism became this new model of mind, when it arrived, you know, somewhere between the 50s and the 70s. And by about the late 60s, early 70s, you start to get things like Jerry Fodor writing about the language of thought. And that's a really interesting book, which frames a whole kind of debate around the way that language plays a role in mind. And for Jerry Fodor, the idea is really that we really have a kind of internal language, which is just like the language that we speak. We already know that. We kind of come into the world in some quite Platonic way with this already sort of, you know, the structure of our thoughts is given through this language. And I guess I always thought this idea was wrong. When I first encountered this idea, it just seemed, I mean, as many people do, I mean, I think Dennett said about Fodor that, you know, he's like a big spring-loaded bed that you can kind of jump up and down on, you know, and, you know, and he bounces back, and, you know, I'm making fists because he's like a pugilist type of philosopher, you know, he loved fighting about ideas, but those ideas seemed to create more problems than they solved. So I think it was really this, you know, kind of encounter with Fodor that started to change things around, so this is where I guess we have to do him great credit, because it was by laying things out so clearly, you know, about what these ideas entailed and defending them, you know, so pugnaciously, that a new kind of philosophy started to get going, which was really quite, you know, tried to rethink, what about if our minds don't come into the world built for language? What if if lingual form structure is not somehow imprinted in our brains from birth? What about if we encounter language as some kind of external system in the world, and our brains reorganize themselves to kind of treat with this? How would that be? What would the picture of mind look like if that were the case?
It is indeed a very big debate involving Chomsky and all that.
Yeah.
But as you say, in the 50s, there was a new way of framing that with the arrival of computation and cybernetics.
Yes.
Perhaps, Philip, you want to dive in?
I would like to return to a wording of yours. You described yourself as a philosopher of mind and technology, so someone who constructs a bridge between analytical philosophy and continental philosophy, if I might put it that way. And I would like to ask you about the condition of contemporary philosophy in that regard. So that perhaps, and I would like to hear your opinion, that such a wording is only possible because we can today assume that we live in a kind of post-philosophical, post-metaphysical or post-human world where certain notions, certain classical notions of philosophy like ontology or epistemology, fields of inquiry, but also concepts such as the mind, are in crisis, and this crisis is always being reinforced by new planetary events such as the climate crisis and wars and so on.
Well, that's a lot. I mean, I think that I don't know. It might be that others can speak better about these. I mean, I think it's true that these categories that we use to think about philosophy, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, are somewhat in kind of free form, being reconstituted. And there's lots of new moves in this area, which maybe I'm not really a specialist on, but I follow in a certain kind of way. So one area that I'm kind of interested in, although I haven't worked in it very much, is conceptual engineering. So this as a kind of approach. I mean, it's got a kind of weird title to people who haven't been conceptual engineering. What should engineers be doing with concepts? And I mean, I guess an analogy might be something like this. I mean, once upon a time there was this thing in analytic philosophy, conceptual analysis, which of course in many ways is pretty close to conceptual engineering, but conceptual analysis. And again, it would only be a slight caricature to say that at one point the idea was, let's see how people speak, let's see how people talk about concepts, let's see the concepts we use, and we use this to kind of construct an analysis of what concepts they're using. And of course that makes sense, right? If people talk about love in a certain type of way or friendship in a certain type of way, you can say, is that really a friend? Is that really and the one way you can kind of test it, you can look, do people really use the word friend in that way, or maybe they're using the word in multiple ways, and that's a kind of conceptual analysis. And early analytic philosophy is very much taken up with that kind of approach. And then more recently we do, this has become a bit more empirical, where people might even, try to, use questionnaires to find out what people actually really say, not just what philosophers think they say, because, there could be different things. But the interesting thing about conceptual engineering is, maybe our concepts are not really adequate for the circumstances that we encounter. And obviously feminism plays quite a big role in, developing this idea of conceptual engineering. And so it may be, and this is probably to move things on a little bit, but it may be that our concepts of mind are not adequate for making sense of the condition that we find ourselves in today. It could be that's possible. It could be that, and this is when we started writing. I mean, I know perhaps I'm jumping the gun and coming onto this, but when we were collecting essays and I was writing this long introduction to the mind technology problem, I mean, it seemed already at the time that there were sort of really quite dynamic changes in how people were conceiving of minds. And it seemed to me, it was not, it was not coincidental that this takes place as people encounter more and more artificial intelligence technologies or other technologies which can do some mind-like things. So the question is, what happens at this point? What should one do? Should one just carry on using the concepts that one has and think that they're somehow we come equipped with the perfect concepts to understand the world as it is? Should we reshape our concepts to take account of, some of the weird new technological advances that we encounter? I mean, there's a series of possibilities. I mean, and I think you could hold the line, right? There's a way of saying, look, this is a mind. I know what a mind is. Whatever this AI system may be doing, that's not a mind, right? It's not. It just because. But then you have to define what you think a mind is, and say something more about it, and then we've kind of to step up to the contemporary scene a bit more. We're finding on an almost daily basis people are encountering technologies that do more and more things that superficially look like they're the things that mind should do. So now, what do we want to do? Do we want to hold our concepts without changing them because we had the right concepts about mind in the first place, or might we need to evolve those concepts? And I think the bit about conceptual engineering, which to me is very interesting, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about this at the moment more, writing some things about it, is that it may be that there are a number of possible pitches that we could adopt, right? Maybe there's no simple right answer. does this system have a mind or does it not have a mind? Is this a property of mind or is it not a property? Or is it a property of technology? It may be that we have to kind of decide what we care about in order to draw the lines in certain ways. So at the moment, you find cases where people are saying, trying to look at circumstances where AI systems might have rights. That's a potential, that's a thing that people think about, write papers on. And for some people, it seems entirely necessary because the direction of travel is such that these systems have more and more human-like properties. So at some point, if things continue that's going to be something we're going to have to care about. For some other people, this is making a kind of metaphysical error, or at least an ontological error, an error about, the nature of being, about, and by even entering into these questions, it could be kind of dangerous. So there are, so in a sense, our values that we bring to the question are also going to play a role in, what ontological categories we develop. And it seems to me that we're right at this moment where the categories are difficult to apply. Let's put it, maybe, difficult to make consistent. So things are moving. That's the one thing I'm sure about. Things are moving. What we consider to be mind, what we consider to be an emotion, what is thinking, what is cognition. All of these questions are, to extent, up for grabs, and in different ways. I mean, cognition is always a bit of an artificial term, actually, at least in English. There's no... People, I think if you go to people in a bar or in a coffee bar and ask them what cognition is, they don't have strong intuitions, right? So if we do that analytic philosophy game, they don't have strong intuitions. But if you ask them what a mind is, I mean, they, so they kind of know. They say, does the microphone have a mind? Of course not, Do other people have minds? Yes, of course they do. What about chimpanzees? Yes, probably today they would say yes, but Descartes might have said no. What about a cat, a dog? Yes, they have minds. What about an ant? We're not so sure, And so how to apply those categories? And now, of course, we have this new class of entities that you can sit down and have a conversation with. Even people like, Blake Lemoine, who's become this kind of sort of cause celeb, was fired by Google, or quit Google. I'm not quite sure what the full story is. That he was messing around with this system. He'd been employed to work with this system, which was a large language model trained on dialogue, Lambda, by Google. And in many ways, this question that I've been working on, some other people have been working on for the last few years, was kind of given. He became the poster child for this when he told the press that he believed that Lambda was his friend. Right? That it was. He said it was sentient. Sentient is another problematic word. I mean, we might have a stronger sense of what we mean by consciousness, but sentient is kind of a vague word. Once again, a chimpanzee may be sentient, your cat or dog may be sentient. What about a lizard? What about an ant? Some people think amoeba are sentient. So what he was actually saying is not entirely clear, but it created this kind of, anxiety, deep anxiety. Google, one of their scientists, one of their engineers, actually what is prepared to say that this system is sentient, whatever that means. And, then very shortly after, many of us started to encounter these systems, to talk to these systems. And of course, they have properties which are, seemingly miraculous. If you know anything about the history of artificial intelligence, they seem to be things that you just would not expect they would be able to do. Although I work in philosophy, I work with lots of people working in AI, and I have done for the last 20 years. And, I've paid a lot of attention to that discipline. The things that the large language models can do now, I think it's reasonable to say that all bar a few engineers, people or scientists working in quite recondite areas just would not have thought that these systems could do so quickly. So it's been a big surprise. It's been a big shock. It's been, if you like, it's been an existential shock. It's been a shock about what is possible in this, and what one can build and what one can make. And so at the moment, we're still in this, we're in a phase of conceptual anxiety, I guess. We
Although
don't know.
some kinds of ambitions were as old, at least, as Alan Turing's vision of the universal machine, right?
So before we talk about the LLMs and large language models, I would also like to question about something that you said and that Teresa now mentioned. There was a big discussion at the beginning of artificial intelligence about what is intelligence and the definition of intelligence, with scientists and authors such as Norbert Wiener or Alan Turing or Marvin Minsky, but a discussion that you can trace back to computer science and programming pioneers such as Ada Lovelace, for example.
Yes.
And, well, I would like to ask you most general but perhaps also personal question, and that would be, what is your understanding of artificial intelligence? What is for you artificial intelligence? And I would now, I would ask you a follow-up question. Well, if you subscribe to the notion of extended cognition, would you argue that intelligence was or is always already artificial in a sense? So this is a paradigm shift, but perhaps not such a big one as one might think.
Yeah, the first part is quite a difficult question in a way, because, I mean, if you go back to these original meetings and this Dartmouth conference, which is where some US scientists got funded to try and solve the problem of intelligence in the summer famously, and it was quite a grandiose project. I think if you look at that point, I mean, the word artificial intelligence could have been lots of, they could have been working on the artificial mind. They could have been working on artificial rationality or something like that. So in a way, I think the word intelligence is quite difficult. It's easy to get hung up on. I think it's quite problematic. And there's, I've forgotten the name of it, but there's one, I think it's a computer scientist who said, something like artificial intelligence is always the thing we haven't done yet. And you can kind of look at this history. So at one point, I mean, the classic example is chess. So at one point, chess is sort of a paradigm case of what developed, educated minds can do. It's this thing which is kind of stands in for reasoning of a certain sort. And then at some point, we build a machine. We build Deep Blue. IBM builds Deep Blue, which beats Garry Kasparov. I mean, actually, it plays chess. The processes, the algorithms which are behind Deep Blue are very, very different from what human minds do when they're working on chess. We know that. That's not really a hypothesis or something. But once you've created a machine that can do that, it seems like, well, maybe that's not. It's almost like the intelligence kind of dissolves from it in some way. Maybe that's not intelligent after all. Maybe it's, or maybe it's the wrong sort of intelligence. And it's almost like I guess you could say it's a kind of almost like a dialectical process. But you might think the dialectical process would gradually refine away, all of the outward signs of intelligence until you get down to the core. Right, this is really the real intelligence. Now we found it. This is the thing. But of course, that's not what's happening. What seems to be happening is we find that we can build machine models of more and more processes, which work more and more like, at least, the neural systems in our brains work. And does this mean that we now have a really good definition of intelligence that everybody would sign up and agree with? Or I can write at the beginning of the book I'm writing, this is what intelligence is. It doesn't. And we don't have that definition. And so, I mean, I can give you a kind of, it might be able to, you could try to define intelligence in something like, adapt, the ability to adapt to carry through complex behavior in many circumstances and adapt to changing circumstances. You could do something like that. I mean, that's quite close to what I might think. But actually, we know about human intelligence that it's not infinitely adaptive in all circumstances. You know, if I've got skills to play basketball, I can't necessarily go and use them to play volleyball immediately. You know, maybe that wouldn't sound like intelligence in some ways, but many of our mental abilities are a bit more skill-like in some ways, I would contend, and they tend to be quite circumscribed, at least in the short term. So I think what we haven't, I think artificial intelligence, I wouldn't say it's a failure as a program, but what we have, if you saw it as a pure some kind of conceptual investigation to understand what intelligence really is, I mean, that seems to have just kind of disappeared a little bit. What we've got, lots of cognitive processes, lots of kinds of adaptive behavior, you know, and some of it very dependent, some of it very dependent on the environment. And so this is probably brings me a bit to your second question. And so is human intelligence always artificial? So I think if you're asking that question, I'm kind of imagine that you can correct me, that you're thinking about artifacts and the way that we build things that kind of are then involved in our cognitive processes. Well, I'm definitely on the side that would say it's pretty artificial. I mean, it depends where. Before we started filming, we were talking a little bit about evolution and adaptive behavior, and you know, the idea that, you know, perhaps the human mind is evolved for one particular scene, the savannah, a couple of 100,000 years ago, and it's kind of adapted to this scenario. But so in that sense, you might think, well, humans did have artifacts around this time. You know, they did have artifacts, basic artifacts. But those artifacts have gone through, you know, radical reconstruction. And yeah, our intelligences have kind of been transformed with these processes. So I think there could be intelligence which is not artifactual, in the sense that, you know, if you just want to, but it's a little bit arbitrary that it's evolved intelligence. Of course, you know, if animals are intelligent, they have evolved capabilities. But human intelligence, it seems that it's very, very bound up with our use of artifacts. So in that sense, maybe yes.
Yes, it is an ecological perspective, so to say. And this would take me to my next question. You presented some arguments in favor of an ecological perspective of intelligence or cognition. In a certain sense, the ecological approach states that different artifacts, different media build or form different ecologies. So the ecology of a book is not the same one as the one of cinema or of photography or of the computer. And you spoke about a computational model of the mind. And my question would be the following. So, given this ecological point of view, or given this ecological perspective, would it be possible to argue that today we are facing a kind of plurality of ecologies, even in the ecology of the digital? So, in the sense that programming, for example, or a programmer or an engineer does not live in the same ecology as, for example, someone who does data visualization or someone who does prompting. So would it be possible to argue that speaking of one model would be perhaps reductionist, and we have to speak, in fact, about a chain of ecologies or multiple ecologies?
Yes, I think that sounds right to me in a way. So certainly the work I've done for the last 10 years has been typically, and this is probably what, if anything's unusual about what I've been doing really, is that I've tended to look very specifically at particular, you know, digital technologies typically and how people interact with them. Not in a super empirical way, in the sense that I'm carrying out questionnaires or I'm doing that kind of research, but to look at how people interact with, say, you know, it seems to me, let's put it like this, it seems to me like interacting with a smartphone as a computational device, a personal computational device, is very, very different to what happened. I can still remember the early days of personal computers, right? Because I remember when the first word processors kind of came in, that seems a long time ago, when I was writing my undergraduate, I wrote a kind of undergraduate thesis. And we had the early word processor, and you sit down and you consult it. The internet was just coming in, but there was no World Wide Web. That actually came in when I was doing my master's. But at that point, I mean, machines, this is a bit crude, but they were grey machines, right, with a certain kind of colour that you'd sit down and were bulky things attached with these big wires, and this is before the days of cookies, which became this thing which would kind of track you, so everybody in some way would be seeing the same internet, right? So you typed in a prompt and you'd see this thing, and that gives a certain kind of interaction pattern. And one of the things I've made a big deal out of, I'm still making a big deal out of it, is that goes through a major transition once you start to get to mobile devices. It's something different. So the mode of it, this is very ecological, right? The mode of interaction, in many, many respects, determines the pattern of cognition. I'd probably go along with that. But I've even used the word determine there, right? It does make it sound very determinist, possibly, right? So you could go down a kind of route to say that, and I think a certain path, I mean, somebody like Neil Postman, who's a writer I like very much, I've been very influenced by, I've taught his work, but at some points it sounds like, so he talks about he probably doesn't use the word cognitive ecology, but let's say he does, he doesn't use that word, but he talks about the
media ecology.
Yeah, the media ecology, exactly. The media ecology, or the values of television. And that tends to make this very sort of, it's like now we are in the pattern of media ecology of television, and that we think of Marshall McLuhan and people like that, of course, and it determines certain patterns of thought. Well, I think what you're perhaps suggesting, and I would go a long way with this actually, is that really one would want to look. It may be the case in the time of television you can generalize a lot, right? But one of the things that I think holds open some possibilities is that the kinds of devices that we have now we are tending towards the generic smartphone, that's true. But people do have their own ways of interacting with it. The ecology of apps is very interesting, where people choose their own apps. I remember when I used to do it, I much more use a more vanilla thing now, but people curate their apps. They have their favorite apps. They have their favorite patterns of interaction with these apps, And then, of course, we have people like somebody who's an architect and using, computer-aided design or something. So the sorts of patterns of interaction that they build up with these systems are clearly very different from, somebody who's somebody who's using Google Maps, or somebody who's using like an EasyJet booking system, And the more that you come to depend on a certain kind of interface, it's very likely you're building up certain kind of habits of mind and patterns, which are quite personal. So I at least think it's possible and indeed likely that that there are vast differences in how people use these systems. So I think this is not to say they don't have any kind of determining power. They don't shape things in a certain kind of way, but there are patterns of interaction. Patterns of interaction have histories. I mean, one of the startling things I'd say is like how quickly we can build these up. Right, people get a new device, they find it does something they want. It doesn't really quite work in the way they want, so they build up their own way of using it, and they get over some of the, the kludges and some of the difficulties of the system, and they develop their own patterns. And very often, I mean, if you want to look at things like, I think you're interested in these things, sort of artistic practice or creative practices. I think very often you find that people are kind of pushing the technology in ways that it wasn't designed for. And then I know we haven't really got onto this, but if you get onto some of the sort of uses of generative AI, almost everything people are doing with these systems right now was not what that technology was designed to do. Right, that technology was designed. This is a little bit simplified, but large language models were designed to be translators. All the other stuff that's been done with them since has been a big surprise, and some of that stuff has happened because people are, pushing them to do new things. Now, I know when I start to talk this way, people will sometimes think I'm a bit utopian about these things. You know, hey, we can do anything we want. All patterns are possible. That's not the case either. But the patterns of interaction are really important. People can have great differences, I think. And the way that we build up these patterns, you know, what we request, the way we customize things, customization is very important. You know, I think there is a lot of, if you want to look for human agency, it's very often in this kind of the microstructure of our interaction with technology and the patterns we build up. So yes, I mean, long answer, but I think absolutely, you know, those things are very possible. One of the things, just one last thing on that, insofar as that ability to build up your own patterns around systems or to make them do things they weren't designed to do are kind of closed off. And there are some things that kind of close off those possibilities. That's what really limits human agency, in my opinion. It's really those, you know, it's really when we end up with like just so there is a problem with, for instance, prompts, you know, speaking or just typing a prompt or something, even compared to like apps on a phone. Because when you've got an app, you do have this kind of this it's easier to reflect on the interaction in some ways, right? It tells you very clearly what you can and what you can't do, and then you can maybe push it in a different direction. But when you speak, as is already increasingly the case, people are not typing prompts, you know, they're talking into their Bluetooth headphones or whatever. It seems to be so naturally like talking to another person in some ways. And the response you get, you can't see behind the response. You know, response is closed off. I mean, we've called it's reflectively opaque up to you know, you get the result. You may even be very skilled in performing, getting the things you want back from it. But there's lots of stuff which goes on behind the scenes. And in some ways, yes, that does limit our abilities to shape the technology to our own ends. You know, that's the more risky, dangerous element of it in a way.
On the topic of techno-determinism and maybe seeking a path that doesn't tell us that we are just at the mercy of media structures and of the impact theories, I still have to talk about what I believe to be the prevailing journalistic discourse on new media, which tends to emphasize their harmful effects on human cognition. And someone like Nicholas Carr insists on the fact that new media are reorganizing our neural resources, that we are becoming unable to sustain concentration and to have attention, and to do deep reading, etc. So your work, particularly when it engages with Lambros Malafuri's material engagement theory, offers a less apocalyptic version of this. And you identify a co-constitutive interaction between the human mind and these technical artifacts, rather than just a unilateral impact. But my question is, to what extent can a materialist and extended view of human cognition still safeguard human agency in a cybernetic era when these devices are embedded with teleologies, with purposes like profit-driven orientations that escape the user's control? How can we rethink agency in this context?
Well, in many ways, that's the biggest question of all, I think. I mean, you know, what happens with human agency? So you mentioned this impact word. So impact is a word, it's an inescapable word, which I very much dislike. And I try to use it. And I taught this course here at our university twice. It was called Mind, Self and 21st Century Technology. And it was a fun course, and sort of the first time I taught it, it was all about social media, and the second time I taught it, it was all about generative AI, because that stuff came in so quickly, and not all about that. But that's a digression. But one thing I tried to do both times was I talked about the impact metaphor, and I tried to ban my students from using the word impact in the class, so we weren't allowed to use the word impact. But none of us, including me, could do it, right? It's just a natural. But when you think about it, I mean, the impact, I call it like it's like a ballistic metaphor, right? The missile comes in, right? That's the technology. And we, the poor, quivering humans, are kind of struck by it and decimated. We have no, there is no resistance. Now, I would say we do have some means of resistance, if you like. But apart from that, the very metaphor tends to disempower us, right? It's a metaphor where it makes us passive and the technology have all the agency. And I think if you look through the history of technology, that's simply not the case, right? What you find is technologies are invented. Often they're invented by someone for a determinate purpose, or sometimes people just make strange stuff up and then they find it's really useful and people go, but people make it. And then very often it's repurposed, right? The history of technology is a history of turning things to new ends, to creating things that people like. Professor of technology, a friend of mine, James Woodhoyson, always used to talk. This is very old. This is like out of date completely now. But who would have said that the remote control for a television, which I can still remember, you had to walk to the television and press the button. Who would have said that would be used to watch two channels at once? Because now you can flick and you can watch your sports program and you can watch whatever. You can flick between them. And this is, the history of technology is a bit like this. We make some tool, and I think if you look at the way that people have repurposed a whole range of technologies, particularly, the app culture, people turning them to different ends. I mean, of course, there are commercial interests. Of course, they are designed very often, not always, but very often to get us to do something, right? Technologies has designs on us. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. But you find people have lots of resources to turn them to different ends. And I mean, if you to keep coming back to generative AI, but if you think that a technology was developed to do machine translation, is now used for people to write their essays or plan their day or decide on presents for their parents or something, the purposes, or as I'm using a program, Notebook LM, to reflect on, I write a chapter, I feed it into this thing called Notebook LM that makes a podcast of it. And the people argue about my work as though they're having, these virtual people. And then sometimes they interpolate all kinds of things. And I think about this and, I probably shouldn't reveal this because there's all kinds of rules about, the role that generative AI can play in your writing now, right?
You're totally right. We didn't really need to be here.
Yeah. But, these things, although they are weird, they're so... I guess I would put it like this. We can go into what resources of agency we may have, but I would put it like this. It would be surprising from the history of technology if we've developed a new technology now which completely incapacitates human agency. What you typically find is that, technology is invented, it destroys some professions, it creates some new ones, it gives people capacity to do something. Some of the things they end up doing, they don't necessarily want to do when they started using this technology. It creates new needs, creates new demands, but it also creates new possibilities. And this is something which is always a contested process. It's contested between the producers of the technology. It's contested by what we now call consumers, the users. And I think there's lots of realms of possibility, and one has to get into, So I'm talking about this very generally, but ultimately you can't really talk about it generally. You have to talk about almost on a case by case basis. And I think there are human resources, but I think there are patterns as well. And this is kind of this. We slightly talked about this before, but this can be. Human beings do things through patterns, right? Once you develop a capability to use something in a certain kind of way, you tend to go on doing that until it stops working or until you find something better. And but some people are very avant-garde and they want to make up their own patterns. They don't like other people's patterns and they'll do their own thing. And those things are often very interesting and they're new. But most of our skills and most of our abilities are actually framed through these patterns, and they're typically technology involving. So the process of making something or thinking about something, I mean, we sort of touched on this before, is typically not something that happens in a sort of quasi-Cartesian inner realm, immune from the environment. It's something that happens. It's materially involved. And it would be it's not impossible, but it would be totally surprising if we invented a technology that reduced us to having no agency in the process at all. It would have to be, in a way, an unprecedented technology. Who knows? Maybe we will invent such a technology. But at the moment, that's not really what I see. What I see is, struggle to people to turn things to their own ends. And, that's probably what we need to pay attention to that, because it probably is. So this is where the difficulty comes, I think, in our moment, our historical moment. It could be that we are allowing ourselves to be conducted by patterns that we really shouldn't want to. That some of the patterns and some of the things, like there's so many struggles at the moment, struggles over creative appropriation, for instance, which is not something I've worked on very deeply, but it's clearly in the background of all this stuff with generative AI, all the data. I mean, this puts it very extremely, but you could see this as the greatest act of intellectual theft in the history of humanity, right? I mean, you could put it in those kind of terms. I've put it in those terms myself. But then again, we get to use all of this stuff, at least at the moment. But then again, somebody owns these systems typically that we're using, and we may come to build our skills around these systems. And then, rather like Notebook LM that I've been using for the last few months, it might suddenly then become the premium product. Oh, this thing that you've built skills around and you've been using, now you have to pay for you have to pay to use. And so we're in this kind of complex moment of contestation, in a sense. And I mean, I don't want to be, so I'm not apocalyptic about these things that you've seen, but I mean, it could be that the patterns which are laid down now, not just patterns of use, but legal patterns, expectations, may shape the cognitive futures of humanity for a long time to come. I think it is a moment a bit like that. It is Gutenberg again. It is something where something's happened and we don't really know how to think about it, and we don't really know. And various people are trying to own the process or try to push the process in a certain kind of way.
So replacing this loaded word of impact with a more benign word of influence.
Okay.
If we still recognize that media and the media systems in any ways influences, and we as users are also bound to become technical elements of these systems, functional elements of these systems, can we think of an update to the extended cognition that positions cognition in the side of the technical system, the non-living entity? And can we study it if its phenomenology is inaccessible to us?
Okay, so when you say its phenomenology, are we talking about? I'm not quite sure what you mean. Are we talking about whether technical systems have their own phenomenology?
Yeah, if they have their world of experience.
Yeah. So I've written about, particularly very recently, I've written about this. I invented a term which I kind of like, but ersatz others. Okay, so this bit of terminology was just it's particularly again around these systems which have hit the news. These systems where you can build, or you can subscribe to, or you can have a kind of virtual friend made through, and people are utterly compelled by these systems. Some people, I mean, this is the thing, right? Not everybody. I have a replica. A replica, for those who don't know, I mean, I'm finding it being advertised to me on my phone, and there's some other. It's like your special virtual friend made from a generative AI system who you can have deep personal chats with, intimate conversation. Your virtual lover as well, but not exclusively, in this domain. Indeed, this, sex and these things is kind of a complicated, it's already had some ramifications which are, very worried. Indeed, one person, not with Replica, but with another system, a young guy, committed suicide. The last thing he talked to was a chatbot. and he's been kind of apparently developing a relationship with this system over a number of months. This is a very extreme use of these systems. Many millions of people are using these systems now. They are a mass use technology. I mean, one thing I certainly, after studying them with some detail, I am fairly convinced. I am convinced that there is nothing it is like to be a replica bot, right? So, or another kind of chatbot that we exist in the moment. I leave open the possibility we could build such a system, but these systems, you probably notice it's a philosophical formulation to do with consciousness that we say, if there is something it is like to be an entity, that entity is conscious, right? There is something it's like to be that entity. Then you could say that in this, it has its own phenomenology. Phenomenology is a funny word because it both means like a science of phenomena and it means having the properties of, having phenomena. It's used in two contradictory ways, actually. But in the sense that you mean, I don't think these systems have a phenomenology, but they can interact with us in ways, intimate, interpersonal ways, which are incredibly engaging. We've created these kind of systems, and at the moment we don't really know how to deal with them. So I call them ersatz others because they fulfill the role. If you think of continental philosophy and you think about the other, maybe more in the Sartrean kind of way, the person in I see my own reflection through interacting with them. I kind of reshape myself through the sense of this other as someone who looks back at me and whose gaze kind of takes me in. And the idea is that human beings we shape ourselves partly through these deep personal interactions with others. In many interactive ways, these systems can already fulfill the same kind of role as another person can, at least a superficial level. In deeper ways, they do not. So I mean, we can say things like this. They do not experience anything of us when we talk to them, right? So in one sense, it's just necessarily a one-sided relationship that you're going to have with a bot. And so but they can engage in, or they can reproduce many of the dynamics, in very, very detailed ways. And in fact, because I have something of a background in artificial intelligence and computational archaeology, in terms of computer systems as well, I think very quickly these systems are going to do some things. They're going to be a bit more. They're going to have their own personal histories. It wouldn't be wrong to say that, right? We already know how the architectures would work to make these things seem more like not just that they have a kind of narrative, to put it. And so these systems invite engagement in very concrete ways that we've never had to really think about an artifact being able to engage in before. And I think it has lots of implications which really we're just starting to think about. I mean, the ethics of this are in many ways a new kind of ethics that we're going to need to think about these systems, because they're artifacts, because they're owned, because they're produced to do certain things, but they are ersatz quasi-persons in some ways as well. They at least can fulfill some of the roles. So how we're going to think about all of that stuff, I think, is very, this is what this project with Notre Dame University is really about. To try and think through some of these, the implications of having such systems. And I think there are, I mean, as you've probably, I don't think that all of the implications of these systems are not necessarily negative, right? So I use this example of the boy who committed suicide, which is obviously horrible. Some people if we had Eugenia Koida here today, who is the CEO, I believe, of Replica, and, one of the people who developed the system and has spoken most about them most openly, she would tell us that there's been good empirical results that people who use these systems report having less feelings of loneliness and indeed knowing as we do that suicide is a real big problem, in the 21st century. People who are having suicidal thoughts say generally that they have fewer such thoughts when they're interacting with one of these bots. So there is an argument you could stage. I don't really know the facticity of it. That they can have positive side. They could. I'm certainly open to the idea that they could have positive, numerous even positive psychological possibilities, or even psychiatric possibilities. But they're still different. There's still something that we're doing which is new with these systems, and so we have to think very, very carefully about the implications of what we're doing. Even if pragmatically you can show that I'm not saying you can, but even if pragmatically overall we can say that these systems have benefits, maybe they do, but still the question is, what are we doing to ourselves with them? I think that's.
If I may jump in, if we're talking about LLMs, I think in a sense what we are saying is not entirely new, is that language, after all, is indeed a big deal. Yes. Language does have a very detailed model of the world. Yeah. And of all kinds of entities like humans. And in a sense, that had already happened with literature. We're supposed to be transformed to feel all kinds of things, or with religious texts, right? So in a way, some of the magic that we are still witnessing with LLMs is the magic of language, and how it can enclose a really rich model of the world. Of course, the discussion now is how far LLMs will take us, but it still has a very detailed model of the world, and that's something that we always knew language had, and of course we were always surprised how true that is when we read poetry or read a novel, or when you think of Goethe talking about how he suffered just by writing Wörter, right?
So look, I think that's very important. But I think one of the funny things is, so my experience of, the strange sort of trajectory of artificial intelligence research, for instance, is that in some ways language became quite minimized in maybe the last 30 or 40 years, quite a long time. And this could take us off track a little bit, but there was there's been a big argument amongst people like myself and other researchers who are interested in being in the world, if you like, who are interested in what it means to really have a mind, and one argument was that this GoFi that we touched on earlier was a kind of an argument that I would have subscribed to, is that it's a kind of bibliophilic nightmare or something. It's the idea that what we just carry around, a kind of encyclopedia in our head, and our thoughts are just kind of somehow written into some kind of code in the language of thoughts in our brains, and this is what we really are. And one of the biggest movements, inspired by this guy Rodney Brooks, the bad boy of robotics at MIT, who was building these little creatures, little robots that could just walk around a desktop or something. And they had no internal models. They just kind of reacted to, they had lots of sensors and just interacted to the world. And one thought is that this kind of idea that we are representational beings, that, somehow have unconscious, linguiform structures about, that allow us to do many things we do. This was very out of fashion in many ways. This was an idea. So actually, one of the things I'm kind of writing about at the moment is, if you were following this trend of AI, this sort of the wave against GoFi, large language models look like a miracle, right? Large language models shouldn't be able to do what because they're not embodied, right? Not in any very direct, they're almost, we talk about 4E cognitive science, I already mentioned this, embodied and active. You could argue that they're kind of 0E systems, right? They're not embodied, right? Their embedding is very, very partial. They're not interactive very much. They only respond, actually, at least the very early ones. Now I think they're becoming something else. But what we find, and this is where I think you're absolutely on the right track, what we find, in fact, is if you build a system that reads all the text and can create, massive multi-dimensional representations of this text, it has a tremendous knowledge of the world. A knowledge of the world that in many ways is absolutely shocking. If you come from this kind of background of thinking that embodiment is the whole story, which if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have been absolutely arguing for this. But it looks almost like you can't explain what's happening. It looks like this is the opposite of what we should have found. The thought was we build bodies for AI systems, and then they kind of develop intelligence by engaging in patterns of sensory motor interaction. But actually, and maybe that's true. I'm not saying that's not true. But actually what we find is if we build some other really weird system that all it does is just read all the text and then builds these abilities to kind of autocomplete, just to complete whatever the most next likely phrase is put into it, that embeds a whole bunch of intelligence into the system that can pass bar exams, that it can give you you can take your medical symptoms and, give you a reasonable diagnosis, that it can write a story for you about bereavement or complete the story you're writing about bereavement and you can win a literary prize with it, or all of the other, miracles. That's a chapter of my book that I'm working on at the moment. It's called The Miracle of Large Language Models. And it's because it seems like this technology shouldn't be doing what it's doing. And it's a real question. People who are working in this field are trying to understand it. But I think you're absolutely on the right track that we kind of forgot just how powerful language is, really. And now we've built a system that can use it in a variety of ways. And we find, in a way that would not have been such a surprise perhaps to, previous generations of scholars or the humanist tradition.
A system that has a tremendous knowledge of our psychology and
Yeah.
can very easily manipulate us.
Yeah. And
in a way.
Yes, that's what we found.
Sorry, maybe to return to the question of artificial people, ersatz others. Your most recent research area is centered on companionship in the digital age. And some of us, with not so convincing irony, refer to ChatGPT as their friend or their therapist. And about this, I'd like to ask you two questions. The first one is this extroverted tendency to perceive minds or possible extensions of our mind in things that are inanimate, that are non-living, is this a fundamental human trait? That's the first one. And the second one is, and maybe this is still a work in progress, but I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about what new forms of feeling, of emotion, might emerge from our growing intimacy with these artificial people.
Yeah, okay. The second one is the big question, actually. I might have to think about it a little bit more. But, I think your first question, yes, this would go back to Dennett. I may not have anything very original to say about this. I think Daniel Dennett has argued for something he called the intentional stance. And the intentional stance is, I don't think he used this word, but I kind of think of it as a sort of projection. When we talk to other people, we tend to assume that they're rational, assume that we can kind of make sense of what they're saying, and assume that we can explain their behaviors, desires, their questions, their thoughts in terms of beliefs and desires. So we kind of project this nexus that helps us make sense of others. We talk about, and then one of the big arguments in philosophy of mind from the 1970s is, what's the literal truth of beliefs and desires, in a sense? Are beliefs and desires like photo thought? They're kind of almost like computational states that you could kind of, if you had the right kind of technology, kind of read off from the brain. Robert thinks that the microphone is on the table. There would be some kind of belief box in my head where you could find the microphone is on the table in some way. Or like Dennett thought, these are kind of projections that we use to make sense of the behavior of others. So if I'm trying to think about what you might do next, if I think you're thirsty, that might allow me to predict a whole bunch of stuff about your behavior. And it's a kind of predictive process. It's a way that we do something which is very, I say we, largely unconsciously, we in order to interact with others, we just make sense of them by projecting this completely open-ended set of beliefs and desires onto them. It just seems to be part of what human beings do. Now, there were questions again from the 70s onwards: do other animals have this, or is it something? Maybe chimpanzees do it, but we certainly do it. We certainly do it. And one of the things that also Dennett pointed out again is that it doesn't take much to evoke this apparatus, right? You could look at an ant crawling across the tabletop, and the ant's trying to get off the table, right? He believes we wouldn't say believes, but the ant's trying to get off the table. I put my hand there. Oh, you think, he's seen I've blocked him off. We make all these kind of mental attributions, which we might just do with a computer as well, just a computer like the laptop over there, or even a program, Word's really trying to frustrate me today, or, it's just so easy. Or as Denny, I think, pointed out in a chess game, even with a chess computer, we say like the chess program is trying to get its queen out early. And this carries a lot of information, and it helps us make predictions. It helps us do all these kind of things. But what we've known, for ever since Weizenborn and Eliza, is that people will project onto conversational systems, a very great deal. Even if they know that the system is very simple, just doing some kind of very basic syntactic processing, people will, under many circumstances, not under all circumstances, under many circumstances, make elaborate projections, because this is just what we do when we converse. It seems that we make projections of mental states. And so, okay, I just take that more or less as a given. I mean, just a little side comment on this, though. It does seem that some people have done, I've forgotten the name of the study, to be honest, but some empirical research does show that many people are actually happier talking more about sort of deep and intimate problems or thoughts with a computational system than they are with a therapist. They will reveal more than they would when talking to a therapist or maybe their best friend. Now, why is this? This we don't really know. But, for whatever reason, maybe it's because they're not people that they're talking to, right? It's a way, maybe sometimes, we know we are conversational beings, many of us, and we want to talk, and sometimes we don't feel we can talk. So I think this is a space where therapeutic bots, chat bots, in many will enter into. And I also think of some colleagues of mine, Lucy Osler and Joel Kruger. They've written about thanobots, I think they call it, chatbots of the dead, where people use messages to train up a system or get somebody most likely to do it for them, which then stands in for a person, and they talk to this system as a kind of a way of this is just one use case, if you like, but talking to in some sense to the person that they've lost. And this is a very interesting area. So some people are, find this deeply worrying. One reason for this is people talk about replacement worries, and I think it's quite easy to see what this might be, right? So the replacement worry, in more general terms, is that we worry that some of the intimacy that we have in conversation with a chatbot will replace the intimacy that we have with other people, right? Now, as it happens, it may be that we do a whole bunch of other things. It may be that you really know that you've lost someone. But in other, for instance, non-Western traditions, people might talk to ghosts or something like that. It's quite possible that people have other kind of relationships with the dead than just moving on. So some people may not want to move on. They might want to continue to have some kind of conversation. It may be that a whole bunch of their mental habits are based on the conversations they would have. So this system could step in and do something for them, even though they know 100% that this is not the person who's died, or this is not the person that they're, but they're still able to carry on those kind of, some of the mental self-regulation and some of the emotional self-regulation that they can't do in the absence of the person. So I think for these kind of reasons, it's very important that we adopt a kind of critical but not judgmental view on what people are actually doing with these systems, rather than just jump to conclusions about it. And I think, I suspect we're having a meeting on this later in the year, and I suspect there will be lots and lots of different takes on this, very different takes, because at the moment it's being kind of created, the patterns of behavior are being created. So I think it is quite possible that, new types of emotions I'm not so sure about, but new kinds of emotional engagement with technologies, new kinds of ways of being with technology. It's very, I think that's happening already. People are, and this will go back almost to our question about determinism, because I think if you read or study this stuff or listen to all the podcasts there are about it, this is where one finds most of the material. Or listen, Eugenia Koida of Replica is somebody I mentioned before, but listen to her talking about it. Some very thoughtful, and listen to her talking about what people do with her systems. Obviously, she has a kind of interest, but she's still very worth listening to on what people do with these systems. I think it's very various. Right. Let me say this. Some things that some people are doing with these systems make me absolutely uncomfortable. Right. Me, but that's my personal, some things are, ethically very problematic. Some things are probably dangerous. Right. But then there could be a whole class of other stuff where people are, one has to think about the so-called epidemic of loneliness. Right. Where many people, even 15 years ago, people were saying this. Even, in the early days of social networks, 20 years ago, people were saying this. Many people in America, which always seems to be in the vanguard, would say they have no friends, large numbers of people, or they have no deep personal contacts. Now, it's obvious with this technology, in this kind of scenario, that some people will enter into, inverted commas, relationships with these systems. What are we to make of this? What are we to make of this kind of you can see lots of films about it as well, of course, but what are we to make of this sort of existential possibility? I think it's a very complex question. That sort of sounds like I'm just avoiding it, but I really don't want to just adopt a moralistic tone about it. This is bad, because it's a straightforward replacement. If we had Eugenia Koida here, she would probably point out something like, well, many people who have been in abusive relationships or had difficult, or maybe never made a friend, have used these systems in a kind of experimental way to try to, not replace human social contact, but find a way into more intimate relationships with other people. And I think, one would have to really look at the quality of these relationships. One would have to look at the, developing history about how people and what people do with these systems before one would come to any firm judgment. So I think, yes, into your second question, there's certainly new types of emotional relationship involving all kinds of, possibly personal transformation. This could happen. To valorize it, we're probably still at an early stage, but it's certainly, I would say we're in some very new existential territory in some ways. I think that's not unreasonable to say.
A well-known media theorist, Friedrich Kittler, has always pointed out that our relation to media is really a very strange one. In a way, media is what we access the reign of the dead through. A library, a simple library, is a way of talking to the dead, or perhaps listening to dead people, right? And of course, cinema has brought a lot of ghosts to our world. So, in a way, the fact that media has in charge the possibility of transmitting experience implies that, in a way, we are always accessing some kind of ghost area of our experience, namely the dead. Right.
Look, I think that's a very, that's a very interesting observation. And I think the thing that I keep thinking about in this regard, it's not, and I think it resonates with quite a few people actually, that, so this is going to a completely different scale. But if you go to the very beginning of what we call Western philosophy with Plato and Aristotle, and you look at the Phaedrus, it has this kind of, well, I won't talk about the myth of Thamos, which is when it's in a sense that 5th century Athens is when writing has become a technology where people are now mediating all kinds of new things, right? And they've only really had it for a couple of hundred years, because as we know, there was a Bronze Age, Dark Age in Greek culture, where at one point there was one of the earliest, probably the earliest civilization in Europe, if you want to use that term, literate society, and then they lost writing. And then you had the Aoidoi, the poets, right? And so, like we still had in, for instance, countries like Yugoslavia into the 20th century, or, many countries in Africa, or, this tradition of the singer of songs who would keep the cultural memory and, in some ways would introduce ghosts in a kind of performance. And literary culture, in many ways, kind of replaced that. I mean, bits of it carry on. Of course, we have the Odyssey, we have the Iliad, which are come out of an oral tradition. And so now we've had a couple of thousand years, or if you want to go back, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years, if you really want to go back to the Mesopotamians, of some kind of literate culture, which is completely and it's gone through tremendous transformations. I mean, of course, the internet is still a literate culture, with, and generative AI and these new systems are still a product of a certain kind of literate culture. These neural nets have been trained on all the text. That's what's happened. And now you mentioned is kind of, we may have run out of text, and people are doing all kinds of weird things like trying to translate the internet into Sumerian or, some dead language so it can be retrained, all kind of seemingly crazy ideas to find more data. I have no idea if what that might achieve, but apparently some people are messing about with this stuff, But I do think it's possible to consider. It could be that I don't think text is going to disappear. I mean, just like I don't think reading or deep reading is going to disappear. But it does seem that we might be at a moment where we're having a kind of new relationship with accreted knowledge or the history of knowledge or something like that. I mean, okay, we have a system that I actually used in some teaching here this year, where Andy Clark, who I've mentioned a couple of times, my colleague Paul Smart and I mean, Paul Smart mainly did all the technical work, I have to say, developed a digital Andy. So digital Andy is, I won't go into the tech in too much detail, but it wasn't retrained. But digital Andy is, it uses something called resource augmented generation. Basically, it's a large language model, like you can just use ChatGPT, but it uses all of Andy Clark's texts to produce a facsimile of Andy. And we tried using this in a philosophy class. So we were studying things like the extended mind, and we had the students, have a conversation with digital Andy about the extended mind. And this system is a really interesting system, because not only will it converse, but it will converse based on, you can constrain it, so it will mainly respond based on the text of Andy Clark. But it would also allow you to do a thing, it's partially transparent. You can see what text it's used to generate these responses. So it kind of leads you into text in a new way. At least that's the hope. That's the thought of what we might do. I mean, it would work much better with people doing a PhD or something like that. But so the way that we're going to relate to text, I think, is undergoing a real transformation. And the implications of that are massive, really. So I think Luciano Floridi, philosopher of technology, he has this thing, I can't remember the date, but he says sometimes it actually is the 1st of November 1789, right? By which he means, I know, particularly academics, we don't like to really talk about revolutions because, of course, everything has to be qualified and it sounds, but I think there is something about this moment, this technology we've created, that even against the background of the internet, which was already a massive thing, which already transformed so much, and it becomes so transparent so quickly, so everyday, so just taken for granted. But I think what we've created now and what we're starting to use is the technology which really does probably is going to, we talked about the way that concepts change. I think it's going to change what we mean by knowledge, what we think knowledge is, and you can already see that. I'm already reading things where, epistemology is kind of people, the traditional concepts in epistemology are clearly now having to be, turned around, or people are questioning all kinds of things because the facts on the ground have changed, right? The way that what one considers knowledge to be, I think, it's going to change, and that's going to be tricky. I mean, I think maybe this is something that you want to come on to anyway, but I think this is going to be a tricky scenario for the university. You know, it already clearly is a tricky scenario for the university, how to think about this, you know, when such massive changes are going on.
Perhaps that could take us to a couple final questions on the university, on what you think will be the place of university, both as institution and as infrastructure of knowledge. Should we expect it to keeping not changing, which is very much which is happening to the university in the last few centuries? It doesn't change.
Yeah.
Is it going to change? Is it going to have to change?
I mean, I'm sure I think, of course, some of these conversations have been having public, but I think everybody who works in the university now is sort of talking about these questions because it's an imminent question. I mean, clearly the question of exams or something, and essays. And I mean, another Neil Postman thing, I remember I think it's quite late on. I want to say 70 or 80 years or something. I'd have to check this, that, you know, that people have been giving a mark in universities for their, you know, the idea that you have a grade. And, you know, a sort of quantitative grade, A, B, or C, or 2-1 or 2-2, you know, 20 out of 20, whatever. This is not, you know, if you go back to the history of universities in the church, I mean, you passed or failed, but you didn't get a grade. And, you know, so in a way, it's a relatively new piece of technology. But if you think about, I mean, when I think about this, I think, okay, insofar as, you know, certainly in Anglo culture and, you know, the influence of institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, almost like the gold standard of a university education, is discussion and the essay. I mean, being able to hold your own in the tutorial and discuss ideas and write an essay which reflects on the discussions you would have. And this is very idealized, of course, because people often don't have this experience now in UK universities, certainly with, you know, big classes. But, you know, this is part of what a university is supposed to be doing. But, you know, but dialogue and indeed essay writing is something we now know that these systems can do fantastically well. I mean, they can write, in English terms, you can write a 2-1 essay using a large language model and maybe playing about with it for a bit. And so we all know that the way that we were doing things will not stand. I mean, I have said half ironically, and I guess I'm now saying this on a podcast, that you could argue the university should just close down for 2 years and work out, you know, what a grade is, you know, what they want to do, what we think, how we think we're actually going to evaluate knowledge now. Because I think we don't know at the moment. That's the thing. Because I think the standards for assessing, which is important, it's not everything, of course. The standards for scholarship are shifting given what we can now do with certain technologies, you know, non-human tech or human extended technologies or these new technologies. So we have to think about what we want to do in this context, and it's not clear or evident, I think.
Since most students openly or privately, most students, if not all, rely on LLMs, is there a risk in a decline of a decline in personality, originality within university work? That is, a loss of truly singular research that hasn't been filtered through a statistical average? Are we entering that point where the author's death is not just a theoretical predicament, but a reality?
The death of the author again, yes. Well, look, it's yeah, I'm thinking a lot about this, actually. I'm not going to be able to give you any, so I can give you, so when I've been thinking about this, actually, I used to have lots of friends in architecture, and they often do something called scenario planning. So they don't say, they're not determinists, right? They don't say this is it, but they say we could develop it this way, or we could develop it this way. And if we develop it this way, it has these kind of implications, or, you know, very ecological, actually, of course, they're architects. And I tend to think a bit about our scenario a bit like this. So there's certain, we can't direct the future, but we can try to shape it, right? We can, and so, okay. One thing,
sorry,
yeah,
LLMs tend to do that kind of scenarios very well.
Yeah,
Pros
absolutely.
and cons.
So, yeah,
Dialectics is totally embedded in
is their
in
business,
LLMs.
right?
It's their
Yes.
business.
So I do think so that some research has shown that, for instance, with philosophy students, which is something I'm interested in, that you know, using LLMs to have a dialogue can be very, very positive for you know, the development of dialogical thinking, of dialectic, right? It can be enhancing. I mean, you wouldn't, certainly somebody who works in the university wouldn't just like to turn the students loose just with the LLMs and just say, kind of get on with it. But it would, I would be worried about saying that this is, I'm quite worried about prohibition, you know. I think it almost never works, as we know with alcohol prohibition in America, you know, don't use this. Oh, that's really interesting. Maybe I should have a look at this, right? But I think we're going to find it very hard ultimately just to eliminate this technology. And there is some signs that some uses of the technology can be quite, you know, it's a dialogical technology. You can develop. I think human thought is dialogical, really. I mean, we didn't talk about this, but Vygotsky was another one of my big influences. And, you know, this idea of internalized dialogue is very, you know, it's very important for how I think about mind and how I think about culture. But I think that it's clearly possible to develop these technologies down the route which inhibits depth, right? That leaves us all on the surface, that just, you know, and so there are clear, I mean, there's examples. I think there's a book by Shannon Valora, who's a philosopher of ethics and technology, and she talks about a case where, you know, an ethics course taught for a medical faculty, they get, no, for, I can't remember, some fairly, you know, so the ethicist comes in and gives the, let's say, for the sake of argument, that they are a police force, and they're giving a kind of, I can't remember the exact example, but they're given, they have to take an ethics class in order to finish their, you know, in order to finish their qualification. And it's found that lots of them are using ChatGPT to kind of write their ethics report, right? And in this case, it seems pretty likely that people are now using the system just to avoid doing the kind of ethical thinking that is the very thing that's been probably put into their qualification, because people think you know, we as a society think that somebody like a policeman, or I don't know, an ambulance driver, or, you know, many professions, we think they need to have an ethics course because it's kind of intrinsic to their ability to make decisions. If you can just avoid doing that thinking by kind of outsourcing it to a machine, that's clearly a very, very difficult problem, right? That's you know, in that kind of you know, almost, you know, Platonic, back to Plato, and, you know, the good of the city state, you know, the good of our society is being undermined in those kind of cases. But I don't think that's the whole story. So it does seem to me, even from our little bit of experimentation with the digital Andy system, like I can use, I mean, actually, I can actually ring up Andy if I really want to, and he will consent to answer. But another philosopher that we've built, that Paul, I should say, has built a system of, is Daniel Dennett, who actually died last year. So the Dennett estate, Paul's worked with the Dennett estate, and there is now a virtual Daniel Dennett. So you can have a conversation with Dennett, and because of the way the system is set up, it allows you to dig in behind the works of Dennett, and, you know, it will reference his various works. Or you could have a conversation with Machiavelli in the same kind of way, right? Or you could have a conversation with Santo Agustin. Now, of course, it's not really a conversation in the sense that the embodied person is sitting here, and there are lacunae, right? If you're training a LMM or using some other technique, you're not training on the sum total of a person's life, right? There are bits, you're training on the text that they've produced. So it is a kind of facsimile, you know, it's really their corpus. You know, it's not the sum total of a person. And one has to be very careful about that. You know, and as this goes back to your other question, actually, it's so easy to project, right? I'm having a conversation with Denny. I'm not having a conversation with Denny. I'm having a conversation with this very powerful technology that can, you know, maybe allow me to interact with some of Dennett's ideas in a very powerful way, or lead me into the text in a new way. I talk about generative hermeneutics, right? This is kind of what we're doing now. And this generative hermeneutics, I think, has all kinds of potential, and I believe it's going to revolutionize the digital humanities, which has obviously been a big, you know, digital humanities is not going to be the same after the interactions with these systems. But so I don't want to write it all off, and I think it's very important. So back to universities, right? I think we need to be able to use these technologies and think about them and be aware of some of the pitfalls and some of the problems. And we need to think really hard about what we're doing, about the value of what we're doing, what we want to do with these systems. Obviously, we've taken for granted that we are the arbiters of, you know, reason and discourse and dialect. And, you know, now some of this stuff can happen in a way which is very independent of the universities. But I think we do have some skills, right? We do have some abilities. We do, you know, it's not that we are sitting in judgment on society. I don't think we should. But, you know, we need to try and ensure that what's being done with these technologies is, I'm a humanist, you know, it's still humanizing. It still leads to some of those things that, you know, the development of thought, the development of cognitive depth, the development of emotional engagement, all of those things. And I think it's possible.
One last question about the university in times of digital transition. You spoke about the digital humanities, and perhaps I would like to ask you a very continental question about the digital humanities. So I would like to ask you if you think that the digitalization of the humanities, in the sense that it is being done now, will save the humanities, let's put it this way, from their predicament of irrelevance or obsolescence, or if digital humanities in a certain sense just reinforce or just deepen our incapacity to, our inability to think about the question of technology in the sense of a thing that, or an apparatus that enframes and that controls, that impacts people. So if digital humanities perhaps is just I would say would just contribute to a kind of general amnesia in the humanities.
No, I mean, I think none of that's necessary. I mean, it's just as we were kind of saying in a little cut that we live in interesting times, and in that Mao Zedong sense, hopefully not entirely. Was it Deng Xiaoping? I can't remember actually, but yeah, it was the latter. So yes, so let's look at it like this. I think, so another friend of mine, very excellent philosopher, Keith Frankish, an analytic. I mean, he's got a paper out at the moment on large language models, and he says, like, oh look, it's the fabulous moment for philosophers, right? Suddenly people want to ask us all these questions about, you know, what is thought, what is you know, what is a mind, you know, is this thing got a mind, you know? Suddenly we've got this, you know, great moment for intervention. I mean, I think he's partly right, but I mean, very quickly, and this is maybe what you're hinting at, very quickly things can just become everyday and we just forget the questions, right? I mean, I think one of the purposes of philosophy, maybe particularly the sort of more critically engaged philosophy, is trying to keep questions open for a bit, actually, without coming to, I mean, I like to think of it like this anyway, that we try to, you know, we try not to come to very easy answers. And this, you know, my sort of, I guess, when I've written about depth and I've written about things like the shallows and these kind of things, I always feel that people want to rush to judgment and just say, yes, we're all becoming, there's Amy Orban, I think she's think she's a sociologist. I might be wrong about this, but she's written this really exciting paper that I taught, and it's called something like the Sisyphean. Can't remember the full title, unfortunately. It's something like the Sisyphean cycle of technology panics, right? And it's been a while since I've read this, but the idea is something like if you go right back to the innovation of radio and television, you find very, very similar panics about what technology is going to do to us, right? In this impact model, again, it's going to, do terrible things to children, make us all shallow, and it just recurs again and again. It's very similar things. And then what happens is we tend to integrate a technology into everyday life. It becomes obvious. And then we kind of, some of it's good, some of it's bad. It does change things. I mean, I want to hold on to that. It's not that everything is not just the same, but then very quickly we stop the panics, but we kind of just treat it as every day. And we forget that maybe things are not so totalizing, it's all one way. And then we move on to the next technology. And so there tends to be something about the way that we as a culture react to technology, which is, has a kind of amnesia. That's right. I think that's a good word for it. There's a kind of cultural amnesia about the last thing. I mean, when I'm writing this book about generative AI, I probably spent a bit too much time writing about Wikipedia, which is, it was an amazing technology at the time when it had millions of hours of person time to build this thing. And you suddenly got this online encyclopedia that, is just made by people interacting with it on an everyday basis. And now that's just the background of, Wikipedia. If I ask a question, it comes up the second part in my search for almost any question. And of course, generative AI has been trained on Wikipedia. It's a big part of the knowledge which has been now manifest in these systems. So, yeah, the shape of knowledge. I think the shape of knowledge is undergoing big changes. I think there is, I think the role of academics, the role of people who care about the humanities and care about knowledge is kind of vital. It's a vital moment for us, I would say, but it's the shape of the university. I don't know whether it will continue in exactly the same shape in the future. That's a really difficult question, and it may depend on what we do. It may. I don't think it will be possible just to pretend that a kind of. I hear my own words back, and it sounds very extreme, right? I think it will be impossible to pretend that a revolution in knowledge is not happening. Because I think it is happening. I think there is, the way I tend to think of it as augmentative. I tend to think of these systems as being, as we partially talked about, extensions. But all the questions around that are very difficult. But things that we probably don't have time to get into about when we defer to technology, when we, the circumstances in which we become dependent on a certain way of doing things. I mean, there are some dangers here, but I think this is a moment where probably we have to try and overcome the inertia and really think very hard about these things in public, even though I think it's certainly clear that the universities don't have all the answers. And there may be even reasons, institutional reasons and societal reasons, that we don't want to look at some of the possible answers. Some of the difficulties, but we do have some of the intellectual resources to actually think about these things, and that's what we need to lean on. We need to try to do what we're good at, and actually try to not necessarily lead, but give the rest of humanity the resources to actually think properly about what's happening. That's maybe what we can help with, and then the future. I mean, we will shape it. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but.
Okay. On that positive note and confident note, I think it's time to end this conversation. And thank you very, very much for this long and very interesting conversation. I think it proves that it is a good time to speak to philosophers, to talk to philosophers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.